The room was small, barely more than 4 walls of peeling paint and a sagging ceiling, and yet it held her entire world. The child lay on the thin mattress, his skin hot to the touch, the small damp towel on his forehead already losing its cool. She had been awake for hours, first brushing his hair back gently, then pressing his cheeks softly, whispering words meant to calm not just him, but herself. At first it was just a low fever, the kind every mother recognizes, the kind that passes, with rest and patience. But as night deepened, the boy's breathing grew shallow, his skin flushed in angry red patches, his body trembling in waves. She had tried everything she knew, every old remedy whispered by her mother and grandmother: cool cloths, sugar water, the careful rub of alcohol on the soles of his feet. She had even knelt by his bedside, murmuring prayers, her fingers clutching a small wooden cross that had been her mother's. But nothing worked, and as dawn approached, she felt the terrifying certainty of helplessness settle into her bones. She walked through the cramped space of their home, opening drawers that held only empty papers, feeling around old handbags for coins that no longer existed, looking behind the small fridge as if a miracle might be wedged between the dust and the wall. Her hands ran over the table where once there had been groceries, now reduced to a cracked cup and a spoon with a bent handle. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at the silent refrigerator with its hollow hum, feeling the stillness press against her chest. She checked under the mattress, inside the old tin where she once kept small savings. Nothing. There was nothing. When the boy let out a soft whimper, her heart clenched so hard she had to press her fist to her chest. She returned to him, sitting at his side, placing her hand gently on his burning forehead, whispering, "It's okay, baby, I'm here." His eyes fluttered open just enough to meet hers before closing again, his lips dry and cracked. She knew it now with a clarity that felt like a blade pressed to her skin. The fever would not pass on its own. It needed medicine, real medicine, and she had nothing left to give. As the early morning light began to push its pale fingers through the torn curtain, she felt the silence of the house wrap around her like a shroud. There was no one to call. The father had left years ago, a shadow that vanished without a word. The neighbors had their own burdens, their own quiet miseries behind thin walls. She thought, for a desperate moment, of walking to the landlord, but she owed him already, and his patience had dried up months ago. She sat on the edge of the bed, slipping off her shoes without thinking, letting her bare feet touch the cold, cracked floor. Her eyes fell on the shoes in her hands, old but intact, the soles worn thin from years of use, the stitching starting to give but still whole. And in that moment it came to her, clear and sharp and painful. The shoes were the last thing she owned, the last thing between her and the street. They were her dignity, her armor against the world. But they were also now the only way to save him. The boy stirred again, a soft cry escaping his throat, and she pressed his small hand to her lips, holding it there as if to anchor herself. Outside, the world was waking up, cars humming down. The road, the occasional bark of a dog, the slow rhythm of a city stretching its limbs. Inside, she was a mother on the edge, caught between love and despair, between a pair of shoes and the life of her child. As the sun broke over the horizon, casting pale gold across the cracked linoleum, she rose to her feet, cradling the shoes to her chest. There was no more time for doubt, no more space for fear. She kissed the boy's forehead once, twice, whispered into his ear that she would be right back, that everything would be okay, that he just had to hold on. Then she walked to the door, barefoot, shoes pressed tightly in her arms, and stepped out into the morning, into the streets, into whatever waited for her beyond. The sun had barely risen when she stepped outside, the cool air brushing against her skin, the rough pavement cold beneath her bare feet. She pulled the thin sweater tighter around her shoulders as she hurried down the street, clutching the shoes in her arms as if they were a lifeline. The neighborhood was already stirring awake, shutters opening, voices echoing from apartment, windows, the occasional rumble of a delivery truck, but no one looked at her. No one saw the desperation in her eyes or the tremble in her step. She moved first to the door nearest to hers, the neighbor she had once shared bread with in better days. Knocking softly, then harder, her heart pounded with every second of silence. When the door finally opened, the neighbor peered out with guarded eyes, her face tight with suspicion and exhaustion. The mother spoke quickly, explaining the fever, the need, the child. But the neighbor only shook her head, said quietly, "I have nothing left. I've already helped before," and closed the door gently but firmly in her face. She stood there. For a moment, blinking at the closed door, her breath caught in her chest. Then she turned, hurried toward the small market on the corner, a place where once they had given her credit for a bag of rice, a carton of milk. She entered with a burst of cold air, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The shopkeeper glanced up, frowning, and she spoke with as much calm as she could muster, explaining that her son was sick, that she just needed to borrow enough for medicine, promising she would pay back soon. But the shopkeeper's face hardened, his arms crossing over his chest, and he shook his head before she could finish. "No credit," he said simply, then turned his back, busying himself with restocking shelves. She stood frozen, the shoes growing heavier in her arms, her mouth open but no sound coming. Leaving the market, the weight of the morning settled on her shoulders like a stone. She walked toward the pharmacy, the last place that might hold any mercy. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered, the pharmacist looking up with a distracted glance. She approached the counter, her voice trembling as she explained, asked, pleaded. The pharmacist listened, polite but distant, and when she reached the part about paying later, his expression closed like a gate. "I'm sorry," he murmured, already turning to another customer. "We can't do that." Back on the street, the morning light had sharpened into something harsher, the day now fully awake and indifferent. She stood on the sidewalk, clutching the shoes to her chest, feeling the rawness of the concrete against her soles. Around her, people hurried past, parents tugging children along, workers rushing to buses, couples laughing over coffee cups. No one noticed her. No one saw the storm raging in her heart. For a moment, she allowed herself to sag against the cold brick of a nearby building, resting her forehead against its surface, eyes squeezed shut, teeth pressed into her lip to hold. Back the sound threatening to rise in her throat. When she pulled back, her face damp with silent tears, something inside her shifted. The hopelessness had carved its place, but beneath it stirred something harder, more unyielding. She looked down at the shoes in her hands, at the cracked leather and worn laces, and understood what needed to happen. She slipped them onto her feet, not because she intended to wear them, but because the market was still several streets away, and she needed every step she could borrow from them before they were gone. She took a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and began to walk. Somewhere in the maze of alleys and crowded stalls, there would be someone willing to buy. There had to be. The streets stretched out before her, lined with the familiar and the unknown. As she moved through them, she carried not just the weight of her shoes, but the weight of every closed door, every quiet refusal, every moment where she had been seen and yet unseen. And in the center of all of it, burning like a small sun, was the image of her son's face, flushed with fever, waiting for her to come home. The market was already alive with noise by the time she reached it, a chaotic pulse of voices calling, wheels clattering, children weaving between baskets of fruit and piles of clothes. The smell of fried food, damp earth, and exhaust hung heavy in the air, pressing against her skin as she moved through the narrow lanes. Her feet ached inside the shoes, the leather stiff against her skin, and she felt each uneven stone, each crack in the pavement, as though the shoes already knew they were no longer hers. She moved past tables of secondhand clothes, past crates of wilted vegetables, past faces turned inward to their own small battles. She approached one stall, then another, lifting the shoes slightly, her voice soft at first, then firmer, trying to explain, trying to make them see that they were still good, still worth something. The first vendor waved her off with an impatient flick of the wrist. The next looked her up and down, his gaze lingering too long on her thin sweater and hollow cheeks before shaking his head. She kept going, her heart beating harder with every rejection, her mouth dry from words that tasted more like pleading than she had intended. An hour passed, maybe more, the sun now a sharp white above, burning down onto her exposed skin. She felt the sweat run down her back, felt her legs grow heavier with each step. At one stall, a woman examined the shoes with narrowed eyes, pulling at the seams, bending the soles as though measuring not just the shoes but the woman holding them. When she named the price, less than half of what the mother had prayed for, the mother hesitated only a moment before nodding. Her fingers trembled as she accepted the crumpled bills, folding them carefully as though handling something delicate and sacred. The pharmacy was a long walk back, and with every step the pavement beneath her bare feet reminded her of what she had traded. The first block wasn't so bad. The adrenaline pushed her forward. The thought of the small bottle of medicine waiting at the end of this road pulled her along like a rope. But by the second block, the stones grew sharper. The gravel cut into her skin, and she found herself wincing, adjusting her gait, trying to avoid the worst patches. By the third block, the exhaustion settled into her muscles, and for a moment she leaned against a street lamp, the metal warm from the sun, her breath coming in shallow bursts. When she reached the pharmacy, the air conditioning inside hit her, like a wave, cool against the heat clinging to her body. She placed the money on the counter, her fingers brushing the bills as if to make sure they were still real, still enough. The pharmacist did not look at her twice as he handed over the medicine, the small plastic bottle barely filling her palm, light as air, yet heavier than anything she had ever carried. She wrapped her fingers around it tightly, holding it against her chest, feeling the hard plastic press against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Outside, the world was still moving, people laughing, shouting, arguing over prices, children chasing each other through the dust. But for her, everything had narrowed to this: the bottle in her hand, the road beneath her feet, the boy waiting in the room where the air was too still, too heavy. She took a slow breath, feeling the sting in the soles of her feet, the ache in her back, the faint tremble in her knees. Then she stepped forward, one foot, then the next. The rhythm of survival, the quiet drum of a mother's love beating against the noise of the world. The bottle felt almost weightless in her hand, but to her, it was the most precious thing she had ever held, more valuable than gold, more important than food, more urgent than breath. She kept it pressed to her chest as she stepped back into the street, the sun now high and merciless, baking the concrete beneath her feet. The first few steps were careful, almost cautious, as if her body hadn't yet registered the loss of the shoes. But the ground quickly reminded her. The heat seeped into her soles, sharp and unforgiving, the gravel embedding itself in her skin with every uneven step. She moved forward, willing her body to ignore the pain, focusing on the image of her son, waiting in their small room. His skin still burning, his eyes still heavy with fever. The street stretched before her, endless and unkind, lined with strangers who never once met her gaze. The noise of the market faded behind her, replaced by the low hum of the city, the occasional bark of a dog, the rattle of a cart being pushed over uneven ground. Her legs trembled as she walked, her knees threatening to buckle, the sweat dripping down her face, stinging her eyes. She felt the sharp sting of glass or stone underfoot, a sudden burst of pain that shot up her leg and made her gasp, but she did not stop. She tightened her grip on the medicine, whispering softly under her breath. Not prayers this time, not words for God or fate, but words for herself, words to keep her moving. Almost home, almost there, just a little farther. Please hold on. A sharp cramp twisted in her calf, forcing her to the side of the road where she sank onto the curb, pulling her knees close, resting her forehead against them. For a long moment she sat there, the medicine cradled in her lap, the sounds of the city washing over her like waves she could no longer swim against. A deep, aching sob rose in her throat, and this time she could not swallow it down. It broke free, quiet at first, then rough and trembling, her shoulders shaking, as she let herself fall into the weight of it all. She wept for her son, for the empty cupboards, for the doors that had closed in her face, for the sting of the pavement against her flesh, for the shoes she had given up, for the years of small losses that had led her here. But as the minutes passed, something steadied inside her. The storm of grief did not leave her lighter, but it left her clearer. She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, pulled in a long, shaky breath, and looked at the bottle resting in her lap. She touched it with the tips of her fingers, as if to remind herself that it was real, that it was hers, that it was his. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the rawness in her soles, feeling the sting of skin split and bruised. She limped forward one step, then another, each footfall a small rebellion against the collapse, threatening to pull her under. The streets began to empty as afternoon turned to evening, the light softening, the edges of the world blurring into the hush of approaching night. She passed the corner where the neighbors' children once played, the shop where she had counted coins for bread, the alley where she had stood under the leaking roof to avoid the rain. Each place carried a memory, a mark of her existence in a world that rarely looked her way. And yet, here she was, barefoot and broken, carrying medicine home like a mother carrying her child across a battlefield. When she reached her street, the familiar crack in the pavement felt like a homecoming. Her door stood ahead, the thin wood, the chipped paint, the place where her son waited. She paused for a moment, breathing in the air of her small world, feeling the ache in her body, the trembling in her heart. And then, without ceremony, she stepped forward, opened the door, and crossed the threshold into the place where love had always been her only wealth. The door closed behind her with a soft click, muffling the sounds of the street and wrapping her in the stillness of the small room. For a moment, she simply stood there, the medicine clutched tightly in her hand, her breath coming in ragged pulls, her feet throbbing with every heartbeat. The dim light filtering through the threadbare curtain painted the walls in a pale gold, casting long shadows across the floor. On the bed, the boy stirred faintly, his face turned toward the wall, his small body curled in on itself as though trying to hold off the fever that burned within him. She moved forward with the slow, heavy steps of someone carrying more than just her own weight. Her knees threatened to give way beneath her, and her shoulders shook as she lowered herself to the mattress beside him. The bottle trembled in her hands as she twisted the cap free, the small pop of plastic sounding like a crack of thunder in the hush of the room. She measured the dose carefully, her fingers clumsy but determined, and with a quiet whisper she lifted his head, coaxing the medicine past his dry lips. The boy whimpered softly, his brow furrowing, but he swallowed, and she cradled him close, rocking him with a gentleness born of exhaustion and fierce, unrelenting love. Time folded in on itself after that. Minutes passed like hours, each one measured by the rise and fall of his breath, by the damp cloth she pressed to his forehead, by the soft murmurs she offered in the dark. She stayed beside him, her back pressed against the peeling wall, her fingers laced through his, feeling every flutter and twitch, every shift of heat beneath his skin. She watched as the fever slowly began to retreat, as the tightness in his face eased, as his breathing steadied into something softer, calmer. Outside, the sounds of evening drifted in, the distant laughter of children, the bark of a dog, the quiet murmur of neighbors returning home. Inside there was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of old wood, and the soft sigh of a boy slipping into easier sleep. She leaned her head back, letting her eyes drift closed, her body sinking into the ache and relief that came crashing together all at once. When the first light of dawn touched the window, she stirred, her limbs stiff, her mouth dry, her body heavy with exhaustion. She looked down at her son, his cheeks no longer flushed with fever, his brow cool beneath her touch. His small fingers twitched in his sleep, his lips parted, and the soft breaths of someone no longer fighting to stay afloat. She exhaled a long, trembling breath, her hands coming to rest over her face, fingers pressing into her tired eyes as a quiet, shaking laugh slipped through her lips. It was not the laughter of joy, not quite, but the laughter of survival, of something breaking, open inside her that had been clenched tight for too long. Slowly, she shifted, easing herself from the bed. Her feet touched the floor, and a sharp sting shot up her legs, the raw skin at her soles a brutal reminder of the night's cost. She looked down at them, at the blisters, the cuts, the deep red marks left behind by the road, and then she looked back at her son, at the peace that had settled over his small face, at the gentle rise and fall of his chest. Something softened in her then, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, a tenderness blooming through the exhaustion. She knew there were more battles ahead. The rent was still due, the cupboards were still bare, the neighbors would still look the other way. But in that moment, in the quiet hush of dawn, with her son safe in the fragile calm of sleep, none of that mattered. She had walked barefoot across the city, sold the last thing she owned, endured every sting and bruise the world had pressed against her skin, and she had come home with what mattered most. She sat there beside the bed, drawing her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as the first rays of sunlight filled the room. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself to rest, her eyes drifting closed, her heart easing into the silence, knowing that for this moment, this fragile, precious moment, she had given all she could, and it was enough.